So I'm going to start this out with a statement. And you can write this down if you feel the need. Or maybe you can just commit this to memory. And what I'm going to say is that the notes of a chord are what determine the chord. And the order of the notes is irrelevant. So that's an important thing for you to understand. The notes of a chord make up a chord. The order of the notes is irrelevant. So we're going to study chord inversions. And as you can see here, I have a C major scale written out, a 1-octave C major scale. And as I pretty much always do, I have the notes of the scale numbered for any of you who may not be familiar with using numbers. I have the number 1 here to represent the C note as the first note in the scale. And I also have written underneath the numbers whether the scale tone chords associated with this scale are major or minor. And what we have here essentially represents the key of C major. So what I want to do is I want to start out by taking a look at the C major chord. And the way that we have come to recognize the C major chord is the notes C, E, and G. And this is kind of how we've always represented the chord. And I want to just sort of analyze what we have here with respect to the scale. What we have is we start with the C note, and that's the root note of our chord. So I'm just going to put a 1 under there just to indicate that the C is the root note of the chord. And then we proceed to the E note. And the E note is higher in pitch than the C note. The C is the root note. The E is higher in pitch than the root note. And it's also the third note of the scale. So I'm going to put a 3 there. And finally, we have the G note. And the G note is higher in pitch than either of the C or the E. And because G is the 5th note of the scale, I'm going to write the number 5 in here. So this is the way that we have represented the C note, or excuse me, the C chord so far. We started with the root note, and it's the lowest note of our chord. And then we proceed upward pitch-wise to the E note. And then we proceed upwards from there to the G note. However, this is not the only way that we can represent a C chord. And what we could do, if we wanted to, is we could decide to make the E note the lowest note of the chord. So if we were to do that, and we started with E, we would have E as our lowest note of the chord. And of course, E is the 3rd note in the scale. And then we would proceed upwards in pitch to get to the G note, which is the 5th note of the scale. And from there, we would proceed upward in pitch until we came to this C here, the octave C, to the C that I have the number 1. So now we have the root note. However, the root note is higher in pitch than the other 2 notes. And when we switch the notes around like this, we create what's known as an inversion. So what we have is we have an inversion of a C major chord. We're not starting using our root note as the lowest note of the chord. We started with the E note as our lowest note, and then we just proceeded upwards until we found the G, and then this octave C to get our notes to the chord. And what if we wanted to start our chord on the note G? Okay, so let's say we decide to make G the lowest note of a chord. So now G, that's the 5th note of the scale. So that's represented with the number 5. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing that we did with the other chords. We're going to proceed upward in pitch until we come to the C note here, which is the octave to the note, which is the octave to the note I have, the C that I have the number 1 written next to. So it's a C note, but it's not this one, because we started with this E, or excuse me, with this G, and we moved upward in pitch to the C. However, it is still the root note of the scale. So we'll represent that with the number 1. And finally, we still need the E note. However, we're at the C note here. So what we need to do is we need to proceed upward in pitch until we come to the E note. So now we have the E note that's beyond the C. It's higher in pitch than the C note. So the notes of our chord are G, C, E. And of course, E is the third note of the scale. So now I'm going to represent that with the number 3. So what I've just showed is demonstrated was 3 different ways that we can represent this C major chord. And now what we're talking about is we are talking about chord inversions. So now I want to take a closer look at these chord inversions. And we're going to go back to the first C chord, the one we're most familiar with seeing, where we have C as the lowest note of the chord, and then we proceed to the G, the E, and the G. And if we analyze this in terms of the notes of the scale, we have the first, the third, and the fifth notes of the scale. C is our root note, and our root note is the lowest note of the chord. Well, when we have the notes of the chord written out in this fashion, starting with the root note as the lowest note of the chord, and then just sort of proceeding appropriately with the notes getting higher through the musical alphabet. Okay, this is what's known as root position. Now let's look at what happens when we choose E as the first note of the chord. And I'm just going to take this out of here because I don't want to get crowded for space. So we start with the E, proceed upward to the G, and upward to the octave C. So now we have E, G, C. And if we analyze this in terms of our numbers, we have 3, 5, 1. When we have the third of the chord, that is this E, as the lowest note of the chord, and we proceed in the way we have what's known as the first inversion. And let's take a look at it when we started it and we had the G as the lowest note of the chord. So we had G, C, E. And this is the one where we sort of started at this G, and then we proceeded upwards in pitch till we came to this C. And then we moved beyond this first octave to the E that would be further out here. So when we look at our numbers, we have 5, 1, 3. Well, when the notes are ordered this way, it's what's known as the second inversion. Okay, so this is the basic fundamental information of the lesson. And that brings me to the next level of understanding, because in reality, we have been working with chord inversions the whole time. We have been learning different fingerings. We learned fingerings where our root notes were on the B string and where our root notes were on the E string. And then finally we went to our root notes being on the G string. Well, these different chord fingerings that we've been using are chord inversions. And I sort of want to analyze what we've been doing. And what I want to do is I want to kind of go back to the beginning to the first set of notes in the first set of chord fingerings that we learned. And those were our chords that had the root note on the B string. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to find that root note at the first fret on the B string. We have the C. And I want you to sort of apply that open string fingering that we have. And what I want to do is I want to analyze the notes that we are playing. And I want to sort of analyze them with respect to from the lowest note to the highest note that we play. So if we look at this chord that we're playing, the lowest note that we have is the G string. The open G string is the lowest note of the chord. So we have G, and then we have the root note at the first fret of the B string. So then we have the C, and finally when we go to the E string, we have the open E note. So this is our root note B string version of the chord. And as we can see, this is a second inversion. The note that we're playing on the G string is the fifth. And the note we're playing on the B string is the root note. And the note we are playing on the E string is the third. And this doesn't change. If we use any of these root note B string fingerings for a major chord, the note on the G string will be the fifth. The note on the B string will be the root, and the note on the E string will be the third. Now let's just say we played a let's just say we played a minor chord. Well, in a minor chord, the third is flatted. So for example, in a C minor chord, we would have E flat for our note instead of E. But what is important to understand is that if we had a minor chord, then the order of the notes starting with the G string and working our way to the B string would be, we would have the fifth on the G string, the root note on the B string, and then the note on the E string would be the flatted third. So now let's take a look at the second set of chords that we learned. And those were the ones that had the root note on the E string. So I need you to play that C note that has its root note on the E string. So we've got to go all the way up to the 8th fret on the E string and find that C root note. And then if we apply our major chord fingering, we'll have the C major. Well, let's look at the notes that we are playing, starting with the note that we're playing on the G string. The note that we're playing on the G string is E. And now let's look at the note we're playing on the B string. The note we're playing on the B string is G. And finally, the note that we're playing on the E string is the root note. So now, if we look at it in terms of the numbers, the lowest note we're playing, E, is the third. And then the note that we are playing, which is the note we're playing, the E is the note we're playing on the G string. The note we're playing on the B string is the fifth. And the note we are playing on the E string is the root note. So when our chords have their root notes on the E string, this is the inversion that we are playing. What I want you to try to get your head around with is that the note we are playing on the G string is now the third, the note that we are playing on the B string is the fifth, and the note that we are playing on the C string is the root note. So finally, let's take a look at the chords we've been playing that have their root notes on the G string. So now, I want you to find the C root note on the G string at the 5th fret, and I want you to apply your major chord fingering. And now let's take a look at the notes that we are playing now, starting with the lowest note, the note on the G string. The note we're playing on the G string is C. And now let's take a look at the note that we are playing on the B string. The note we are playing on the B string is E. And finally, the note that we are playing on the E string is C. So now you can see that the notes of the chord are ordered in the familiar fashion. And starting with the lowest string, the G, we have the root note. And then on the B string, we have the third. And then on the E string, we have the fifth. So these are the root position chords. And I'm just gonna take and write that over here. So as you can see, what we have is, and let me see if I can draw some lines here, and hopefully I won't make it worse than it already is. So what you can see is we have 3 separate fingerings, and each chord fingering represents an inversion. So that's basically it. That's it for the lesson. I think when we go back to the guitar, now that we understand these terms and we understand that the chords that we are playing are inversions, now we can start to work to combine these different fingerings so that we can make our playing more interesting, and also so that we can make our playing easier. So put in your time, put in your work, and I hope to see you at the next lesson. Peace.